Hello, I'm Pastor Chad Welch, and this is Helpful Conversations. We are doing a study on annihilationism and just looking to make some videos here on the subject of annihilationism to help my fellow pastors as they encourage, as they work with, as they discuss the subject with those that are getting drawn into annihilationism. My goal is to give information, give thoughts, give responses to the things that are being said by the annihilationist. Uh, as I have looked into annihilationism, those within conditional immortality or annihilationism make a lot of good uh, arguments. And I think it is very important that we carefully address these and take them very seriously and give good responses to them and not just shrug our shoulders. And so these videos are my best effort to look into the arguments that are being made and give a good response to them. And I hope they're beneficial to you. This particular video will discuss Jude 7 and everlasting fire. I've addressed it a little bit before, but wanted to take a deeper look into this particular verse, which is used frequently by annihilationists to prove that the everlasting fire does not have to be a fire that burns eternally or continuously forever and ever. And so today we'll look at Jude 7 in the Greek. We'll look at Jude 7 in the context. We'll look at Jude 7 in a similar passage. We'll look at Jude 7 in the Bible survey of everlasting fire. We'll look at Jude 7 in the Jewish use of everlasting fire. And then we'll look at Jude 7 in a survey of Sodom and Gomorrah. And through these, look at this and try and see what is the best understanding of Jude 7 and its statement concerning the Sodom and Gomorrah and the everlasting fire. Let's start our study here with a look at the Greek. You have in Jude 7, according to the New King James, this, as Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities around them in a similar manner to these, having given themselves over to sexual immorality and gone after strange flesh, are set forth as an example, suffering the vengeance of eternal fire. And so it's that last phrase, suffering the vengeance, or set forth as an example, suffering the vengeance of eternal fire, that we want to discuss today and take a look at. The first thing we want to look at here in the Greek is the order of the words. Most English translations will change the order of the words that we find in the Greek. And so here in the Greek, we have the green word, the word highlighted in green, which is set forth. And then we have in yellow, we have the word that is often translated as example. So set forth as an example. Then we have in blue the word for fire, and in the magenta the word for eternal. And so set forth as an example of eternal fire. Then we have vengeance suffering. And so you can see here that eternal fire follows example. It does not follow suffering vengeance. And most English translations will take eternal fire and put it after suffering vengeance. So it reads, set forth as an example, suffering vengeance, the vengeance of eternal fire. When really what it says is they are set forth as an example of eternal fire, suffering vengeance. And so the idea is that while they are suffering vengeance, they are set forth as an example of eternal fire. And so that's what we want to understand first is the order of the words, and I want you to see that clearly. The fact that eternal in the magenta, fire in the blue, go with example in the yellow is also demonstrated by their case and their number. Degma, the word for example, is singular neuter. The word for fire is singular neuter. And the word for eternal is singular neuter, further indicating that those three words are meant to go together and that it is better to see them, eternal fire, as describing the illustration or the example of. And so there is the order of the words and the grouping of the words as it is in the Greek versus how it is frequently translated. Now let's walk a little bit through the words that are used here. The word that is in the green means set forth or display as evidence. It is frequently used in court cases where you are putting forth evidence, putting something forth as evidence. And so Sodom and Gomorrah are set forth, and it is in the present tense, so they are set forth currently. They are set forth as evidence, or they are put on display as evidence. The Greek word in the yellow, degma, is a word that can mean example, a sample. It can also mean an illustration to make something known. It can mean a warning. And so there is a range of usages there of that word. And one of them is indeed a sample of the very thing itself. The very thing itself. And so when it says a sample of eternal fire, it could well mean that it is the eternal fire itself. But it can also mean an illustration to make something known, or it can mean a warning of something. And so it is up to us as interpreters, looking at all the evidence, to seek to understand what is the best use of this Greek word, and how is the author using this Greek word? Is he actually saying that it is the fire itself, or is it an illustration of the fire, or a warning of the fire? And so it is set forth as evidence and as an illustration to make known the eternal fire. Or not the eternal fire. There is no definite article in this to say the eternal fire. There is in Matthew when it talks about he's sending him to the everlasting fire. There's a definite article. There's no definite article here. But he's saying they're set forth or put on display as evidence, illustrating the eternal fire. And then it says in the red, undergoing or enduring vengeance. Now, the important thing here about the word in red, the word for enduring, undergoing, suffering, is that it is present active. And the present active indicates that Jude is presenting the suffering of Sodom to be present tense. He is indicating that the suffering of Sodom is continually going on, that it's still happening. And so the Greek wording, it doesn't say they suffered past tense. It says they are suffering vengeance. And so in that they are still suffering vengeance, they are set forth as an illustration of eternal fire. And so again, how is this important to the discussion of everlasting fire, the discussion of eternal punishment in hell versus annihilation in hell? Well, when we think about the everlasting fire, we have to understand that this word in this verse does not have to mean that it was everlasting fire that destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Furthermore, we need to understand that Jude is not saying that when they were destroyed in the past, that they were that they suffered vengeance. His wording indicates that they are currently suffering vengeance. And because they are currently suffering vengeance, they can be set forth as an illustration of eternal fire. And so the ongoing suffering of vengeance is an illustration of eternal fire. And so I would say that that is the best understanding of this verse. But we will look at some other details surrounding Jude 7 and context in Scripture to see if this is the best interpretation of this verse, because there's far more to this than just the Greek grammar and of Jude 7. At this point, I want to take a quick look at a section from the Book of Wisdom. The Book of Wisdom was written about 50 years before Christ came, and though it is certainly not canonical, it does give us a sense of Jewish tradition and Jewish understanding, which I think is important to this conversation as we think about what Jude says. And so this is from the book of Wisdom, chapter 10, verses 6 through 8. It says this: Wisdom rescued a righteous man when the ungodly were perishing. He escaped the fire that descended from the five cities. Evidence of their wickedness still remains, a continually smoking wasteland. And so he talks about Sodom and Gomorrah as a continual smoking wasteland. And so the smoking has continued. The fire, in a sense, has continued. Remember what Jude says by using the present tense. He says that Sodom and Gomorrah are currently presented as evidence of the eternal fire because they are suffering vengeance, or they are suffering punishment. I think this talks about the land and the fact that the land continues to be punished. And because the land continues to be in a state of punishment, this is visible evidence of continued, never-ending punishment. Again, and we'll see this in at least a couple passages of Scripture when it comes to Sodom and Gomorrah. But I wanted us to see here the Jewish tradition, the Jewish beliefs, the Jewish ideas concerning Sodom and Gomorrah and how they understood it, which might give us some perspective to understand what Jude is saying when he uses the present tense verbs, saying that they are currently being set forth as evidence of eternal fire because they are currently being punished. And so again, I think it gives us some good context for this discussion. We'll look at some more evidence, perhaps, that the Jews viewed, and the Bible views, the desolation of Sodom and Gomorrah not as a punishment that happened in the past with ongoing results, but actually, in fact, as an illustration of continued punishment, an illustration of eternal fire, so that we would get the concept of eternal fire. Now, we'll look at some more evidence of that here in a bit, but first let's look a little bit at the context of Jude 7. Jude has more to say about the destiny of man than just Sodom and Gomorrah as an example of eternal fire. And it does Jude a bit of disservice just to look at the end of verse 7 and not look at the rest of the book of Jude. And so here's a few thoughts from the book of Jude in the context here. Verse 5 talks about the earthly fate of the Egyptians as a warning to the ungodly. And so the ungodly should look at the Egyptians, their earthly fate and destruction, and take warning from it. Then verse 6 talks about the fate of some of the demons. And it says this: and the angels who did not keep their proper dominion, but left their own abode, he has reserved in everlasting chains under darkness for the judgment of the great day. And so there he talks about them being reserved in everlasting chains under darkness for the judgment of the great day. And we'll look at some of those thoughts a little bit more here in a second. But he talks there about the darkness and demons being reserved or held in that place of darkness. Then we have verse 7, which indicates that the ongoing suffering, the ongoing vengeance of the land of Sodom and Gomorrah is an example to us of eternal fire, or illustration for us of eternal fire, so that we'll understand the concept. Then in verse 13, we have another statement about the fate of mankind. And it says this: raging waves of sea, foaming up their own shame, wandering stars, for whom is reserved the blackness of darkness forever. And so early in verse 6, he talks about the demons and the fate of the evil angels, and he talks about them being chained in darkness. Now, as we come to verse 13, we are told that the same darkness is reserved for mankind. And so the same darkness that holds the demons is a darkness that is reserved for the unbeliever or the ungodly. And so let's unpack those thoughts here a little bit on the next. We see in Jude 7 that the fate of the demons and the fate of unbelieving mankind is outer darkness. Um, if you look at Matthew 8:12 and Matthew 13:42, similar language is used of outer darkness and the furnace of fire. And I think if you take a survey of Matthew, which I have done, talking about outer darkness and the furnace of fire, you will come to the conclusion that the outer darkness and the furnace of fire are the same place. And some would say, well, how can you have a fire and darkness? Well, we do understand that there's mystery to this fire and there's mystery to this darkness. There are plenty of things we don't understand about the eternal fire that can affect spiritual beings like demons. And so, yeah, it's a different kind of fire. And so we don't have to see a contrast there or a problem there. Uh, Again, I think there's enough evidence to indicate that outer darkness and the furnace of fire are the same place. And so, what do we learn about the outer darkness or the darkness here? First of all, we understand that based on these verses, it's a place. Um, this is a place that the demons go to, and this is a place that the people are going to go to. Just like in Matthew chapter 24, the everlasting fire is a place that people depart from God's presence to go into. And if you watch my video on that passage, you'll remember that there is a definitive article, the everlasting fire, that was prepared for Satan and his angels. And so it is a place, it is the everlasting fire that was prepared by God for them. Matthew 13:42 calls it a furnace of fire. The furnace of fire is a place where a fire has been set, a place where a fire has been started. And so this is a place that people go to, a place that demons go to. Again, as we're thinking about how do we best understand Jude 7, is it the actual eternal fire or is it an illustration of the eternal fire to help us understand and to help us hear a warning? Well, I think the fact that this talks about the darkness, which is associated with the furnace of fire, as a place, indicates to us that the fire that destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah is not itself the eternal fire, but rather is an illustration, a warning. The next thing that we see is that it is a place of judgment for the angels. Okay, this is something that happens in the spiritual realm. This is something that affects angelic beings. This is not an earthly fire. And so Matthew chapter 25, verse 41 tells us that the place of judgment, the fire, the everlasting fire, is for the demons. It was prepared for Satan and his angels as a place for them, a place of judgment for them. And so here again we have the darkness, a place for the demons. This is going to be different than an earthly fire. It's not the same thing. Again, is the Jude 7 telling us that Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed by the everlasting fire? Or is Jude 7 telling us that Sodom and Gomorrah are an illustration for us so that we can understand, so that we can begin to get the concept of an eternal fire and be warned of an eternal fire? The next thing we see is that it is a place of everlasting chains. It is a place of confinement, not destruction. And so beings are confined here. They're not destroyed here. They are sent here. They are confined. Again, we think about what is being told about Sodom and Gomorrah. What happens with Sodom and Gomorrah? Well, Sodom and Gomorrah are destroyed. But God illustrates ongoing punishment by the continued desolation of the land. And that's what Jude indicates. suffering, currently suffering judgment, currently going through judgment. Through the fact that they continue to go through judgment, the land continues to go through judgment, he is illustrating for us ongoing continued judgment. But these guys are not destroyed. They are confined there. We see that the darkness is a place reserved for wicked men. And again, in Matthew chapter 25, verse 30, we are told that the guy at the wedding feast that doesn't have the correct garments, that he is cast into outer darkness. And so as we are looking at the context of Jude 7 and the verses that are describing for us the fate of the wicked, it talks about them being confined to the place of darkness. And this is the place where demons are chained and reserved and confined in judgment. And again, Jude tells us in verse 13 that this is the fate of the wicked. As we look at the context of Jude and Jude 7, what is the overall picture that we're getting from the book of Jude when it comes to the fate of mankind? 2 Peter chapter 2 has very similar language to that of Jude, and I think it gives us even more understanding of whether or not Jude was trying to say that Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed by eternal fire, or that Sodom and Gomorrah are an illustration for us of eternal fire so that we can understand the concept of eternal judgment. We read in 2 Peter chapter 2 verse 4, "For if God did not spare the angels who sinned, but cast them to hell and delivered them into chains of darkness to be reserved for judgment." And there we have, again, the darkness and chains of darkness. We have that place of confinement that is the darkness, but it is also there called hell. Now, that is a different word than is frequently used for hell. It is Tartarus. And the normal word is Gehenna, but still a place of judgment by fire. That was the understanding of the word Tartarus. And so here the darkness is associated with the place of fire and judgment. And so again, we have a place, we have people being, or demons being confined to that, and they are confined there, reserved for judgment. And so this is where they're at while they wait judgment. And again, we'll look at other passages that at other times that talk about what that final judgment is. But here, the darkness is a place where they are confined, awaiting judgment. We go down to verse 6, and it says this, "And turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah into ashes, condemned them to destruction, making them an example for those who afterwards would live ungodly." And so again, we have Sodom and Gomorrah as an example to ungodly people in God's judgment. Now this presents the judgment of Sodom and Gomorrah in the past. And it does present Sodom and Gomorrah as destroyed in the past. Again, Jude seems to present their judgment as ongoing, as continuous. Here he presents it as in the past. However, you get down to verse 9, and it says this, "Then the Lord knows how to deliver the godly out of temptations and to reserve the unjust under judgment or under punishment for the day of judgment." Very interesting phrase there, because it indicates that God is holding the unbeliever in a place of punishment, awaiting their judgment. And so we have the demons being held in chains of darkness, waiting for judgment. And here we have the unbeliever waiting in a place of punishment for the coming day of judgment. And again, I think we can talk elsewhere about what that final judgment looks like and where they go from there. But here he's focused on the people. So as we think about the land in Jude, the land continuing to smolder, the land continuing to be a place of judgment, and so that being an illustration of eternal fire because their judgment is ongoing. We think about the people, and we realize that when the people died in the fire, that their judgment didn't end. We know from Luke chapter 16 that the unsaved unbeliever goes after they die into a place of judgment, into a place of torment. And here in 2 Peter chapter 9 or chapter 2 verse 9, we have that same idea. And so the eternal fire is illustrated on earth by the continued desolation and continued smoldering of the land, and the everlasting fire that started on earth continues in the afterlife as they go to a place of judgment. Again, kind of just helping us get a full picture here, the judgment of Sodom and Gomorrah didn't stop when the fire ended. They went to a place of judgment. They went to a place of suffering. And then we have in 2 Peter 2:17, these are wells without water, clouds carried by a tempest, for whom is reserved the blackness of darkness forever. And I know in the Greek the word forever is not there. And so that was added probably to make it coincide well with the book of Jude. But nonetheless, it talks about that blackness of darkness, which is a place of confinement, not a place of destruction. And so as we look at 2 Peter and looking at a lot of the parallels there with Jude and what 2 Peter is indicating, it is not indicating that Sodom and Gomorrah was, that the earthly destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah was the ultimate punishment of the people. It indicates ongoing punishment. It indicates them going from that earthly judgment into a place of judgment in the afterlife, and they are in that place of punishment in the afterlife, waiting the future judgment. And again, in that future judgment, I believe they will be confined to the lake of fire. But nonetheless, as we think about what Jude is picturing for us, does he want us to see that everlasting fire as Sodom and Gomorrah being destroyed in the past, a past judgment that is done and finished, and then the barren land being an illustration for us of a past judgment? Or is he saying that the barrenness of the land, and again, there are legends of it continuing to smolder, does he want us to understand that that is an illustration for us of everlasting fire? Especially as you think about the people dying, going to a place of punishment where they're awaiting judgment, and then at the time of judgment, they stand before God at the great white throne, and then they go into the lake of fire. Again, what are we supposed to understand? What does this parallel passage indicate for us about the aspect of the everlasting fire? We are in a Bible study here to figure out whether or not the reference to the everlasting fire in Jude 7 is telling us that Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed themselves by the everlasting fire, and thus we can understand the everlasting fire to be a fire that burns up and destroys whatever it is meant to destroy, and then it burns out. And so as part of this, we want to do a survey of everlasting or eternal fire in the Bible. And there's actually only 4 passages of scripture which say specifically or use the term everlasting or eternal fire. And I think as you do a survey and you see the other 3 passages, it will indicate to us a fire that is not an earthly judgment, and is not one that burns out when the fire is completed. The first one is Isaiah 33:14, and there are some questions to the interpretation and disputes about the interpretation here of Isaiah 33:14. but it seems to be the fire that is in the presence of God. It seems to be an indication of the judgment of God, the holiness of God, and what it takes for sinful mankind to be able to dwell in the presence of the holiness of God. And so there, is it used figuratively? The term everlasting fire, is it used of an actual fire itself? It's hard to tell, but in that specific passage, again, it has nothing to do with an earthly judgment, and in fact is talking about the eternal realm, talking about the heaven itself, the presence of God, and who can dwell and live in the presence of God in the face of his holiness and his righteousness. And so again, nothing to do with an earthly fire that burns out and brings destruction. The next one is Matthew 18:8, and everlasting everlasting fire there is synonymous with hellfire. And we'll do another video on Gehenna and what is Gehenna, but that is talking about a fire of judgment in the afterlife that people are sent to. Gehenna is a place, and it is a place of judgment, and it is a place that burns with some fire, and that is part of the judgment in the afterlife. And so everlasting fire, hellfire, Matthew 18:8. Matthew 25:41, everlasting fire. Jesus is condemning people, and he says that he's going to send them off to the eternal fire that has been prepared for Satan and his angels. It is, again, a judgment in the afterlife. Later on in that same chapter, he talks about eternal punishment. Again, not an earthly fire that causes earthly destruction, but a fire and a judgment in the afterlife for those facing the judgment of God after their death, and certainly not an earthly fire. And then we come to Jude chapter 7, which talks about an everlasting fire and how Sodom and Gomorrah are an illustration or a warning of this. Again, in taking into consideration the passages of Scripture, taking into consideration the wording and all of this, is it best to understand that Sodom and Gomorrah actually experienced the eternal fire themselves in their earthly judgment? Or is it better to understand that God is using Sodom and Gomorrah as a warning, an illustration for us of the eternal fire? And remember, Jude, in his word usage, indicates a judgment that is ongoing, not one that happened in the past and is done and over. All right, as we continue to seek to figure out what Jude meant when he said that Sodom and Gomorrah are set forth as an illustration of eternal fire, suffering vengeance, the fact that their ongoing suffering of vengeance illustrates for us eternal fire, whether or not he was trying to indicate for us that they actually suffered an eternal fire and that eternal fire destroyed them, or if they are just illustrating for us or and giving us a warning of eternal fire. Um, and so this becomes again important as to what eternal fire is. Here I have some quotes from the book of Maccabees, um, just to give some context. Again, how did the people of Jesus' day understand eternal fire? How did Jude intend his audience to understand it when they read the words eternal fire? Well, here's some usages of eternal fire from the book of Maccabees, which were written, of course, before Jesus came, before the book of Jude was written, and would be context here for us to understand eternal fire. And so we present them here. 4 Maccabees 12:12 says this: "Because of this, justice has laid up for you intense and eternal fire and tortures, and these throughout all time will never let you go." So the intense eternal fire and the tortures will never let you go. 4 Maccabees 9:9. "But you, because of your bloodthirstiness towards us, will deservedly undergo from the divine justice eternal torment by fire." And so the fire there is eternal, and it is there for the sake of torment. 4 Maccabees 13:15 says this, "For great is the struggle of the soul, and the danger of eternal torment lying before those who transgress the commandment of God." And so eternal torment lying before them. Again, just by way of context, as we try and figure out what exactly was Jude trying to say about Sodom and Gomorrah as an example of eternal fire. Did they suffer eternal fire when they were destroyed? And does an eternal fire burn out? Or is their ongoing judgment an illustration for us of eternal fire? Again, we will continue our studies, but I think this particular survey points in a certain direction. And I understand that in Jewish tradition, when it comes to Gehenna, there were annihilationists at the time of Jesus. And someday when we talk about Gehenna, we will look at those quotes. So for the annihilationist friends out there, I do know that there are quotes of the Jewish people from the time of Jesus' day that indicates that they believed in suffering for a time and then annihilation. But again, this video is about everlasting fire, and here we have some context as far as the Maccabees and the author of the book of Maccabees, what he thought concerning eternal fire, eternal judgment, and what it is. All right, as we continue, we want to take a survey of Sodom and Gomorrah in the Bible and just look at some different things. In this survey, I hope to point out two things. First of all, we want to understand that Sodom and Gomorrah's earthly judgment is not the real or final judgment of the people of Sodom. Again, my understanding of Jude would be that Jude says that the judgment of people is going to be in the afterlife in the outer darkness, just like the demons have been judged and chained in darkness. So the final judgment of people will be to be chained in outer darkness. And so that is the spiritual reality, that is the spiritual judgment of mankind, that the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah and their ongoing punishment is an illustration for us of eternal fire. And so that ongoing judgment pictures for us eternal punishment, which is seen in the spiritual realm through suffering darkness. So mankind's true punishment is to suffer in darkness along with the demons. This punishment is illustrated by the ongoing destruction of the land. And so in several passages, we see obviously the future judgment of Sodom and Gomorrah. Matthew chapter 10, verse 15, Mark 6:11, Luke 10:12, all talk about the future destruction or future judgment of Sodom and Gomorrah, not the city, but the people. And those are the passages where it says it will be more tolerable for the people of Sodom and Gomorrah on the day of judgment than for this city or for that city. And so there is that indication that the ultimate judgment of the people of Sodom and Gomorrah for their sins has not yet happened, and that is yet to come. And so the fires that destroyed them on the earth are not the full and final judgment, again, which Jude indicates. He talks about the people being reserved in darkness, and that darkness is reserved for them. We do have in Luke 10:12 that, verse 15, speaking about hell and referencing hell in connection with the future judgment of Sodom and Gomorrah. And so Sodom and Gomorrah yet have a future judgment, and Jude makes that clear as well. Some other passages of Scripture, Luke 17:29, Romans 9:29, these all look to the past judgment. And certainly, as we think of Sodom and Gomorrah as an illustration of ongoing judgment, there are passages of Scripture that talk about the past destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Nobody is contending that it can't be used that way to speak of a past destruction or a past judgment. However, there are plenty of passages which indicate ongoing judgment, which is the illustration and what Jude is pointing to when he uses it as an illustration. Revelation 11:8 just simply talks about Jerusalem and compares them to Sodom and Gomorrah in their wickedness. Several passages, though, are very interesting in the Old Testament, much like that book of wisdom, which indicates ongoing punishment, ongoing fires, ongoing smoldering or smoking, as an illustration of eternal fire, just like the book of wisdom. There are Old Testament passages which indicate that Sodom and Gomorrah are continuing, the land is continuing to be punished. And so the continued punishment of the land is an illustration of ongoing, or of the eternal fire. And so we read this in Deuteronomy chapter 29 and verse 23. Now in this particular passage, it's kind of interesting because this is not actually talking about Sodom and Gomorrah. It's talking about the land of Israel. And it's talking about what future generations are going to say about the land of Israel and the testimony that Jerusalem will be in the future. And it says this in verse 22, so that the generations to come of your children that shall rise up after you, and the stranger that shall come from a far land shall say, when they see the plagues of that land, and the sickness which the Lord has laid upon it, and that the whole land thereof is brimstone. And so it's describing the land, it's describing the future generations, and it is describing their testimony in the future generations of the land. And it says it is brimstone and salt and burning, that it is not sown nor beareth, nor any grass grows therein, like the overthrow of Sodom and Gomorrah. And so it continues there. But the idea is that the future generations are going to look at the land of Israel and say that it is brimstone and it is burning, and the punishment of the land is not past and the punishment is not over, but it is ongoing. And so we'll see similar things in Jeremiah 49:18 or Zephaniah 2:9. And so, yes, there are passages that speak of Sodom and Gomorrah and their destruction in the past, but there is also that concept of it continuing to burn or continuing to be under judgment. And so, again, we look at Jude, and what is Jude saying? Jude is telling us that the demons are chained in darkness. He tells us later that people are going to be chained in or sent to the same darkness forever. And then in the midst of that, he tells us that the current judgment of the land, the current punishment is of Sodom and Gomorrah, is being put forth, present tense, is presented. The current punishment, the ongoing punishment, is presented as evidence of eternal fire. And so this is a way of God illustrating for us eternal fire, ongoing punishment, as Jude tells us of mankind being sent to darkness forever, outer darkness forever, the mist of darkness forever. God is illustrating that in the real world, currently, in the real world, in the physical world, through the ongoing judgment of the land. And so it becomes, I think, very clear what Jude is saying when he says that Sodom and Gomorrah are presented as an illustration of eternal fire, seeing that they are currently under punishment. That idea that the land is still smoldering, the land is still burning, the land is still under judgment. All right, so as we look at Jude 7 and try and understand what the best understanding of Jude 7 is, when it tells us that the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, that Sodom and Gomorrah are set forth as an example or an illustration of eternal fire suffering vengeance, is he talking about the time that Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed, and that they were destroyed with the eternal fire, and that an eternal fire is a fire that comes, destroys, and burns out? Or is he talking about it being an illustration of the eternal fire and the ongoing judgment of Sodom and Gomorrah being an illustration for us of the ongoing judgment of mankind in the lake of fire? And so, what's the best evidence? What's the best understanding of Jude 7? Well, here's some thoughts. Since the Greek grammar can mean Sodom and Gomorrah were a warning of eternal fire and not necessarily the fire itself. Since the context of Jude and 2 Peter point to a present and future judgment in darkness with the demons. Since the place of darkness with the demons is associated with the place of fiery judgment in Matthew, since the place of fiery judgment is a place to judge spiritual beings, including humans, after passing, since the Bible repeatedly points to a future judgment for the deceased Sodomites, since the punishment of the land of Sodom is presented as ongoing, with some tradition speaking of it as still smoking or smoldering, since the Maccabees give the Jewish understanding of eternal fire as a place of torment for eternity, since Jesus and the New Testament authors' teaching indicate the same thing, it seems best to understand Sodom and Gomorrah as a warning to wicked mankind of eternal fire and not the actual fire itself, which demons and resurrected mankind will be cast into. I hope this video is informative. I hope you carefully consider the information. I hope that it helps you to have helpful conversations with those that are getting drawn into annihilationism. After completing this video, I thought it necessary to add one last slide here, and so this is my final thoughts here. Jude speaks of the invisible judgment of mankind in the darkness with demons. This darkness in Matthew is clearly associated with the eternal fires of judgment in the afterlife. Jude is telling us that the invisible eternal fires of judgment are illustrated for us through the ongoing judgment of Sodom and Gomorrah, or the land of Sodom and Gomorrah, as they continue to smolder. This continued judgment, this continued smoldering, continued judgment of the land is visible evidence set forth as proof, as an illustration of the ongoing eternal fire that we cannot see, of those things that are invisible. And so this is the evidence of ongoing continued punishment for mankind. Again, if these videos are helpful, please like or share so that I can know to continue making content. Thank you.